Ever heard of a legal loophole that could, like, turn a totally normal marriage into well, not a marriage at all?
Interesting.
Yeah, today we're going deep on this Kenyan court case. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
It really shows how tricky things can get with customary marriage in Kenya.
Right, right.
It's been recognized legally forever. But then in 2014, things got a bit more, I don't know, complicated, you could say, when they introduced that Marriage Act.
Yeah, the 2014 Act, it was trying to make, like one system for all marriages in Kenya.
Makes sense.
Yeah, to be more clear and promote equal rights, sounds good.
Totally. A noble goal, but you said there were consequences.
Well, yeah, one of the big things it did was make registration mandatory for all marriages.
Ah, okay, so even customary ones.
Especially customary ones, and that's where things have gotten a little messy, you could say. We're seeing some unexpected consequences from that.
Okay, so the government's trying to make things streamlined, legally speaking.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But how did this court case, what's the loophole here?
Well, see, the Act gave a 3-year grace period for existing customary marriages to register. The deadline was July 31st, 2020.
Okay.
And what we're seeing now is if couples didn't register by that deadline, some of these marriages that people thought were totally valid, they've become, legally speaking, voidable.
Voidable. Okay, that's a new one for me. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
It means it's kind of in this in-between state.
Oh, okay.
It's not automatically invalid, but either person in the couple, they can choose to have it annulled.
So it's not the same as getting a divorce.
Exactly, and that's a key difference.
Wait, so hold on. Annulment versus divorce.
Right.
What's the difference for us, normal folks?
Okay, so think of annulment like erasing the marriage. It's like it never happened.
Oh.
Divorce, that says, okay, the marriage existed, but now we're legally dissolving it.
Ah, I see.
Big implications for things like dividing property, inheritance, all that.
Right. Yeah, that's a legal headache for sure. Especially if you thought your marriage was, solid this whole time.
Right.
So how did this case even get started?
So this case, EMM versus PMK, it went to the Machakos law courts in May 2024.
Okay.
At first, it just seemed like a normal divorce.
Yeah?
Couple married in 1987.
Oh, wow. So way before this act.
Exactly. Under combat customary law, they decided to split up.
So they probably thought, yeah, we're good legally.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah. What went wrong?
Well, EMM, the petitioner, claimed cruelty, exceptional depravity, and she'd even tried to resolve things traditionally before going to court.
Sounds like she was doing everything right, like traditionally right.
Yeah, you'd think so.
So where does this whole voidable thing come in?
So here's the twist. When the case went to court, turns out neither EMM nor PMK had ever formally registered their marriage.
Really?
They missed that 2020 deadline.
Oops.
Yeah, oops is right.
But wouldn't they just, grant the divorce anyway? Their marriage was, like, way before the act even existed.
You'd think, right. Yeah.
But the court, they're bound by the 2014 act.
Oh.
So they ruled the marriage voidable because it wasn't registered.
Oh, so they can't get divorced?
Nope. Because it's voidable, standard divorce is off the table.
Wow. So because they missed that deadline, they're stuck.
Yeah. It's a strange legal limbo.
That's crazy, but this is just one couple, right?
Whoa.
What's the bigger deal here?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The court actually said this ruling, it's a point of public importance.
Oh, so this could affect way more people.
A lot more, potentially thousands of couples who got married under customary law before 2014. If they didn't register, they could be in the same boat.
Wow, so this act is causing a lot more trouble than anyone expected.
It seems that way.
So what did the courts even consider proof of a customary marriage before this act?
Well, it used to be more about showing, like, the reality of the relationship. Things like living together, witnesses to ceremonies, recognition by the community. That was enough.
So less about paperwork, more about what was actually happening. Exactly. It was more about lived experience, community acknowledgement.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So now it's all about the registration certificate.
Pretty much. Yep.
Okay. Wow. So things have really changed. What happens now? What does this mean for all these potentially voidable marriages?
Good question. A lot of people are wondering that this ruling could mean a rush of couples trying to formally register their marriages, even though it's been years, decades even.
Right.
But it could also lead to more conflict.
Oh, how so?
People might try to use this loophole to get out of responsibilities or to, fight over property and things like that.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences.
It's a tricky situation.
It really is. It's like they tried to make things clearer and fairer.
Right.
But they've actually made it a lot more complicated.
Yeah. This whole EMM versus PMK case, it's like We've opened up this legal and social puzzle, and we're just starting to figure out how all the pieces fit together.
This whole situation is fascinating, but also kind of scary, you know?
Yeah.
Like, we've got this law that's supposed to make things more just, but it could really mess things up for people who thought they were doing everything right.
Yeah, for sure.
It's anything BET simple. So what's the reaction been like to this Marriage Act and this whole voidable marriage thing?
Oh, it's definitely been controversial. The 2014 Marriage Act has sparked a lot of debate, and this voidable marriage issue.
Yeah.
It's really added fuel to the fire. There are strong arguments on both sides.
Okay, well, let's hear them. Where do people stand on all this?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that the act is discriminatory.
Go.
Critics say it's unfair to people in customary marriages because it creates this extra hurdle, this registration thing that other types of marriages didn't have to deal with.
Yeah, I get that if a couple was legally married before,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem right to suddenly say, nope, got to re-register or you might not be married anymore.
Exactly. It's like changing the rules in the middle of the game. And this idea of discrimination, it ties into concerns about equality, which is a big deal in the Kenyan Constitution.
Right.
Opponents say the act is creating a two-tier system, like customary marriages are somehow less valid.
It's not just the paperwork. It's like the law is saying their traditions, their relationships, they don't really matter.
Exactly. It's like a slap in the face.
It has to make people feel like their culture is being ignored.
It does. And for a lot of people, it goes beyond just feelings. They see it as a threat to customary systems that have been around for generations.
Right, like the law is disrupting these long-held traditions.
Exactly. Like it's imposing this Western legal framework that doesn't really fit.
Okay, I get that side, but what about the people who support the act? They must have their reasons, right?
Of course they do, especially those who advocate for women's rights.
Okay.
They see it as a step toward greater equality and protection, especially because customary marriage often allows polygamy.
Ah, I see. So the idea is that formalizing things through registration makes it clearer legally so women can protect themselves if things go wrong, like in a divorce or inheritance disputes.
Exactly. They argue that registration brings transparency and security that wasn't always there in the traditional system.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to argue with that, especially in situations like polygamy, where a woman might need to prove she was actually married to claim inheritance.
Exactly. It's about protecting their rights.
So it seems like both sides have a point. Like they're both trying to achieve fairness, but they're coming at it from different angles.
That's a great way to put it. It's like they're speaking different languages, one rooted in tradition, the other in modern law.
Yeah, it's a real cultural clash.
Absolutely. And this clash is happening not just in courts, but in homes and communities all over Kenya.
Wow. It's a real tug of war between deeply held cultural values and this drive to modernize.
Exactly.
So it's not just a legal debate, it's a societal one. This case, EMM versus PMK and all the discussion around the act, it really shows how complicated cultural change can be.
It does.
So how is this tension between tradition and modernity playing out? What are the real consequences of this legal shift?
Well, one of the biggest consequences is the changing role of elders.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. They've always played a huge role in resolving disputes in customary marriages.
Right. So if the focus is shifting to formal legal processes, what happens to those traditional authorities?
Yeah, where does that leave them?
It's a big question, and there are concerns that the act is taking power away from the community and putting it in the hands of the courts.
So it's like the traditional systems are being sidelined.
In a way, yes, and that's creating anxiety. Some people feel like their communities are being disrupted, that their way of life is being eroded.
Right, like they're losing something important.
Exactly, and it's not just about authority. Think about the symbolism of customary marriage ceremonies.
Oh, yeah. Those are full of cultural meaning, rituals, and traditions that have been passed down for generations.
Exactly. They're about so much more than just signing a piece of paper.
Right. It's a whole experience, a rite of passage.
Right. And some people feel like the act is saying those customary practices, those cultural touchstones, they don't really matter anymore.
Like, yeah, your traditions are nice, but they don't count legally unless you do it our way, the modern way.
Yeah, and that feels like an insult to some people.
Right, like their culture isn't good enough.
Exactly.
But then, on the other side, some people see the act as necessary for modernization. Bringing customary practices in line with global norms.
Right. It's about creating a more unified legal system, one that applies equally to everyone in Kenya.
So it's a push and pull between preserving cultural heritage and embracing a more globalized vision of law and society.
Exactly, and the 2014 Marriage Act has really brought those tensions to the surface.
It's fascinating how this one law has sparked so much debate and exposed these fundamental differences in how people view marriage and the law.
It really
It's like we're seeing a microcosm of what's happening globally, this clash between tradition and modernity.
That's a great point, and it highlights the challenges that so many countries are facing, trying to reconcile diverse cultural practices with modern legal systems.
Right. How do you balance respecting different cultures with the need for consistent laws?
It's a tough question.
It really is a real balancing act with high stakes.
Absolutely. And while Kenya's situation is unique, the questions it raises are universal. What happens when traditional ways of life bump up against modern law? How do we define marriage and family in a world that's changing so fast? Who gets to decide what's legitimate? What's worthy of legal protection?
Wow. It's a lot to think about.
It is. These are complex issues. They challenge our assumptions, make us confront uncomfortable truths, and force us to think about the nuances of cultural change.
And that's why it's so important to talk about these things.
Exactly.
It's amazing how one law, trying to simplify things, has actually revealed all these deep cracks in society.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What's next for Kenyan marriage law?
Well, this isn't over.
Yeah.
The EMM versus PMK ruling has really shown the problems with the 2014 Marriage Act. And there are legal challenges happening right now trying to fix those problems.
Okay, so what are people saying? What are the big arguments in these challenges?
Well, one of the strongest arguments is about this idea of retroactivity.
Retroactivity.
Yeah, basically applying a new law to things that happened before that law existed.
Okay.
Critics are saying, look, it's not fair to suddenly require registration for these customary marriages that were already valid under the old law.
Right. Yeah, that's like saying, hey, you need a license for that car you've been driving legally for years.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
And this whole retroactivity thing, it gets even more complicated when you think about property rights and inheritance.
Yeah, especially in Kenya where land ownership is so important.
Exactly, and that's a huge concern with the act.
We talked about that a bit earlier. Can you explain more about how the act might be messing with those property rights?
So the act, because it's all about registration now, raises questions about whether it can change property rights that were already established under the old customary law, even though those rights were set up before this act even existed.
So it's like the government saying, we can change who gets what, even if people thought they knew who owned what based on, generations of tradition.
Yeah, it's like changing the rules after the game's already been played.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially when land is so connected to family and community.
It is. It goes way beyond legal stuff. It's about people's history, their identity.
Right. So this case is really showing the tension between, this idea of having one legal system for everyone and the reality that people live their lives in very different ways.
Absolutely. It's about the state, trying to modernize the legal system and promote equality. But it's also about communities with their own long histories, their own ways of doing things, their own ways of defining what marriage and family means, how inheritance works.
Right, they've got two different worlds colliding.
Exactly, and it shows how hard it is to find that balance.
Right, between respecting different cultures and making sure the law applies to everyone fairly.
Exactly, it's a tough situation.
It really feels like a turning point for Kenya.
It does.
Like how the government handles these challenges will have a huge impact on everything: marriage, family, even land ownership.
Absolutely. And it's not just about Kenya, This case has opened up all these questions about tradition, modernity, the role of law in a changing world.
Yeah, like what happens when the old ways clash with the new ways?
Yeah.
How do we even define marriage and family anymore? It's complicated.
It really is, and there are no easy answers. But even just having these conversations, trying to understand the complexities, that's a good sign.
It shows we're willing to learn and adapt.
Exactly. And this case reminds us that law isn't set in stone. It has to change as society changes.
And sometimes those changes have consequences we don't expect.
That's true. It's a reminder that we have to be careful, even when we're trying to do the right thing.
To be sensitive to different cultures and to really listen to the people who are affected by these changes.
Absolutely. We can't just impose our ideas without considering the impact.
This case in Kenya is a perfect example of that.
It is.
It shows how complicated these issues can be, but it's also a call for greater understanding and dialogue.
It is. We have to work together to find solutions that respect everyone.
Well said. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Thanks for walking us through all this. It's been really eye-opening.
It was my pleasure. I learn something new every time we have these conversations.
Me too. And it's a reminder that even something like a divorce case can teach us so much about ourselves and the world we live in.
It's true. The law touches every part of our lives.
It does, and sometimes in ways we don't even realize. So, until next time, keep those brains buzzing. And remember, even the most ordinary cases can reveal extraordinary truths.
That's what we're here for, to dig deeper, explore the complexities, and hopefully spark some thoughtful conversations along the way.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.